Hello and welcome to EARTHFILE. I am Ayola Kasim. The rapid growth of population, urbanization and globalization are the driving force of environmental problems. However, the challenge is extremely high, not only for the well-developed regions, but in poor parts of the world as well, especially Africa. Recognizing this fact, environment ministers from Africa partner with the United Nations Environment Programme through its Regional Office for Africa and the Division of Early Warnings and Assessment in producing periodic series of environment reports. The third was released in February.
This report is in response to a request made by the African Ministers of Environment and Ministers of Health at a joint meeting held in Libreville, Gabon in 2008. And then later in Luanda in 2010. And as I said, it is supposed to look at how environment and health issues are interlinked in the area of the environment. Now, the key findings point to one thing, that environmental factors contribute about 28% of Africa's disease burden.
Such environmental problems as land degradation, deforestation, declining of marine resources, and water scarcity of deteriorating of water and air quality are on the priority list in Africa. Despite this, Africa possesses wealthy natural resources. Many Africans live in poverty, unable to benefit from the African wealth because of uneven distribution across the continent and partly because of African complicated history of the past 50 years after the decolonization. The environmental problems have already waited a long time for their turn. Among them, there are air and water pollution, inefficient use of natural resources, oil spills, and so on. Environmental problems of sub-Saharan Africa also include air and water pollution, deforestation, loss of soil and soil fertility, and a dramatic decline in biodiversity throughout the region. It is quite understandable that the environmental problems in Africa is crucial and severe. The most compelling problem is that it has one of the world's fastest growing populations. With the fast growth of the population, the environmental challenge increased. By the year 2025, according to some estimation, the population of the African people will be over 1 billion. This means that the environmental challenges will definitely double or triple. The African Environment Outlook is a tool of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment for monitoring environmental management in Africa.
The African Environmental Outlook report offers Africa's policymakers authoritative environmental information to enable them develop relevant policies. Indeed, as Africa's environmental challenges continue to mount, it is vital for all stakeholders to live their convictions and participate fully in environmental processes aimed at steering Africa towards an environmentally, socially, and economically vibrant future.
It provides a framework for reporting at the national and sub-regional levels and seeks to enable African environment ministers to institute environmental management policies and programs for the sustainable future.
This report comes after the decision made by the AMSEN that we have to have environmental report and find out major issues which has been threatening environment in total in Africa, because as we know, Africa is the most vulnerable continent in terms of environmental degradation and also in terms of climate change. So we decided to have the critical analysis on the outlook of Africa and come up with issues which we have now to think critically on policy issues, how to implement them so as to reduce the hazards.
We looked at climate change, not just climate change, but also climate variability, and found that it is a considerable health and economic challenge for the continent, and that increased warming is likely to spread weather-sensitive diseases. These include the Rift Valley fever, cholera, meningitis, and malaria, to mention but a few. In some areas, this warming, the warming caused by climate change is likely to significantly lead to low crop yields, reduce livestock productivity, and also lead to low nutrition levels. And all these collectively have negative impacts on human health. Africa has 33 mainland and 6 island countries, which share 45,649, I would say about that, square kilometers, kilometers of coastline, and over, the biological products from these marine areas are found in ingredients in a lot of pharmaceutical products, cosmetics, and nutritional supplements. However, the report identified land-based pollution to be responsible for 80% of the pollutants that are found in these coastal and marine areas. And these are normally a result of agrochemical runoff, oil refinery sludge, and untreated sewage. The poor management of coastal and marine resources affects the economic, food, and nutritional security of communities, leading to negative health impacts.
The African Environment Outlook 3, the UN Environment Programme, highlights the major drivers of environmental change in Africa and their implications for human health. Focusing on 7 priority themes: air quality, biodiversity, chemicals and waste, climate change and variability, coastal and marine resources, fresh water and sanitation, and land. It finds that environmental factors contribute about 28% of Africa's disease burden, notably diarrhea, respiratory infections, and malaria, which collectively account for 60% of the known environmental health impacts in Africa. The report suggests that unless Africa's leaders prioritize environmental and health issues and prevent the degradation of health-promoting food and medicinal plants, health and productivity will continue to suffer.
We found that indoor and outdoor air pollution, unhygienic or unsafe food, improper waste disposal, absent or unsafe vector control, and exposure to chemicals are the main leading issues in the area of environment and health. About 10% of the disease burden in Africa is attributable to inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene, and it is evident that children bear the most burden. With respect to indoor pollution, it is a profound problem. We know, the rural area kitchens in Africa, and we found that, indoor air pollution is 10 to 30 times higher than the World Health Organization limits. And outdoor air pollution is currently thought to be responsible for about 40,000 deaths per year in the region, with acute respiratory infections ranking 4th in the share of the total disease burden.
According to this latest outlook, the continent is rapidly losing its biodiversity wealth due to uncontrolled exploitation and fragmentation of natural habitats, largely due to rapid population growth and agricultural expansion. Increasing rates of deforestation, overgrazing, soil erosion, and desertification threaten biodiversity of medicinal and food security value.
We looked at biodiversity and noted that Africa is rich in biodiversity resources, and if used appropriately can boost the development of the region and support improved human health. We noted that biodiversity provides goods and services such as food, medicinal plants that promote human health in Africa. And 80% of Africa's rural population is said to depend on traditional medicines and not the modern medicine. So that tells you how much is harvested from the biological diversity for management of diseases in Africa, especially in rural areas. However, we found that rapid urbanization, population growth, and agriculture expansion, invasive alien species, overfishing of both fresh and salt water, overharvesting of resources, and destruction of habitats threaten the provision of these goods and services, such as these medicinal plants that provide human health in Africa.
There is at least a study made by WHO in our joint collaboration, where we find out that 60% of children in 5 African countries, particularly in the West African countries, are treated by plant medicines. And we are having what is called Health and Environment Strategic Alliance with WHO, UNEP, and other agencies. And we set up what is called a situational national analysis, meaning that in each country, we go into not only looking at the problems, but looking at also the opportunities. So indeed, this aspect that you are mentioning is part of now the program in terms of assessing exactly what is the potential we are having, because we have to be mindful that this is also related to access and benefit sharing within, as you know, the Biological Diversity Convention. We have to make sure that we protect our potential in terms of what we have that can be used in terms of economy, but particularly in terms of health also.
Of course, for us, Africa, we have been using this after the colonial, before the colonial. These hospitals and the clinics, they came after, yeah. But then our rural people have been using this. Even now they are using, because we do have areas which are very remote, without hospitals, without health centers, etc. So our people have been surviving with these herbicides. So what we are saying, it is very, very important to continue conserving it, because together with having hospitals and having clinics and so forth, but then the values of ecosystems are still not known in terms of medicinal plants.
Dumping is another chemical management issue that is prevalent in Africa. The Outlook describes it as a symptom of weak regulatory and enforcement regimes that enable highly toxic and mislabeled chemical imports into the region. The indicators of the compromised ecosystem integrity, the report states, is as a result of toxic waste, which includes freshwater pollution. While rapid growth of the petroleum industry in Africa has the potential to lift millions of people out of the poverty trap, the necessary safeguards need to be instituted. This, according to the authors, will help to prevent pollution of water sources at highly harmful scales. A case in point is the contamination of wells in the Niger Delta with benzene, a known carcinogen, at levels over 900 times above WHO limits.
The report also looked at chemicals and waste and found that chemical use has both negative and beneficial effects. It also identified agrochemicals, mercury, persistent organic pollutants, chemical stockpiles, electronic and electrical waste, normally referred to as e-waste, and petroleum waste being a growing problem in many countries in Africa. The 2006 dumping of toxic chemicals in Abidjan, for example, led to 17 deaths and illnesses in over 30,000 individuals. A recent UN report also in the Niger Delta identified the presence of benzene, a known carcinogen, which has contaminated wells, and the levels are at 900 times above the WHO levels. And about 7% of 350,000 people in Kenya, in the agricultural sector, suffer pesticide poisoning every year.
There are critical issues regarding lead, cadmium, and mercury. These are heavy metals that are posing a lot of problems in the environment. Lead, mercury, and cadmium, some of these are components of the byproducts of the industrial products. And when they enter the environment, they actually come closer to the human health, and through different means, some of these goes in the food chain, and the effect to human health starts from children, the youth, and the old age. As you know, most of the chemical effects in the human body start showing up as you grow old. So basically, you might not experience any problem when you are still young, unless the toxicology level is very high. So basically, we are negotiating to see that the UNEP puts critical measures and also to focus attention on African countries who are being recipients in most cases of the toxic substances.
The findings of the African environment are 3 assessment points to a number of actions which, if adequately taken, can make promising policies work effectively. This include adequate data, an information system for decision-making, stakeholder engagement, institutional mechanisms to ensure alignment and collaboration, capacity development of all stakeholders, and clear implementation roadmaps with realistic targets and funding mechanisms.
It's not about doom and gloom, it's about setting out the facts and basically looking at those scenarios for the future and saying, we are not going to live with those scenarios in the future, we're going to change them. And the extraordinary activities that are going on in Africa right now make one confident that indeed many of those scenarios can be stopped from happening. Because whether you look at Kenya with the expansion of the geothermal electricity, the new wind farm that's planned in Turkana, whether you look at Uganda with the extraordinary growth in organic agriculture, now exporting huge quantities around the world and boosting livelihoods, whether you look at Tanzania with the forestry sector and the partnership that's now starting to grow with the United Nations on reducing emissions from deforestation, and malaria too, whether you look at DR Congo and the development there of a green economy and better ways of managing the natural resources, Ghana with phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and investing in education. There are so many positive examples on this continent, and what we have to do is accelerate and scale those up, which is why this conference here is from Rio Plus 20, outcome to implementation, and we need to implement all the good policies that are out there, all the good examples of good practice, and I'm sure we can do it. And the gloomy scenarios in here won't be achieved because collectively on this continent, with UNEP, with the African ministers, we're going to make that difference.
In some instances, adequate responses to environmental changes that impact human health have been delayed, not necessarily because of policy gaps, but because of the inappropriate organizational structures for implementing existing policies.
We have a special meeting in September this year, and we will use that forum to give this copy to each minister and make an emphasis, because after having that, we will have a technical committee which will be held in April this year in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, now to look at different programs, how to have projects, how to send the messages to rural people and different people in Africa.
Now, the environment ministers will deliberate on the recommendations in September to determine the best approach in dealing with the challenges mentioned in the outlook. And that's our program for today. Thank you for joining us. Do you have any comments or questions? You can send them to us by writing to earthfile@channelstv.com. See you next time. I am Ayolaka.